At 3:14 p.m. on a rainy Thursday, I watched Victor scribble his name across a whiteboard like a kid marking his territory on a bathroom stall. Compliance is a bottleneck, he barked to no one in particular, while half the team nodded like bobbleheads wired for fear. I'd seen dogs with better instincts. I didn't say a word, just quietly double-checked the time stamp on my submission to the auditor, quarterly compliance report, digitally signed, archived and certified. My initials, locked and loaded, were the invisible keystone to this whole shaky skyscraper of a startup. Without them, the $250 million funding round everyone was foaming at the mouth over, just a PowerPoint fantasy. 7 years of hauling this place out of regulatory quicksand, and my reward was being told I was too slow because I wasn't high-fiving developers during their ping-pong breaks. The new COO, Victor, freshly poached from some doomed crypto outfit, had been here 2 months and already managed to convert the air into pure smug. His version of leadership was announcing agile transformation while forgetting to update the vendor risk protocol. But that was the game. I'd learned to keep my head down and my name off the Who's Expendable spreadsheets. Let the boys talk. Let them clap each other on the back and marvel at their own reflections in Zoom meetings. Me, I was just the woman who knew where the legal landmines were buried. Oh, and before we go on, if you're enjoying this kind of corporate chaos, do me a solid, click subscribe and toss a like. 90% of you listen without subscribing, and trust me, watching those numbers tick up motivates us way more than Victor's pep talks ever did. Anyway, I'd gotten used to being invisible, until Victor started trying to erase me. First came the streamlined meetings where I was left off the invite list. Then the weird CC drops from email chains I'd initiated. But the real canary in the compliance coal mine? One Tuesday morning, I found my audit checklist rewritten in Comic Sans. Comic, freaking, Sans. He wanted to gamify the process. I wanted to duct tape his face to a quarterly risk report. Still, I stayed calm. I documented everything. I ran every workflow like it might be my last. I checked every clause, every vendor cert, every godforsaken two-factor login, and prepped the firm for this mega funding round like I was building a house that had to survive an earthquake and an SEC raid at the same time. By Wednesday, the documents were sealed. Internal disclosures filed. External packets triple reviewed. And my signature, my actual legal signature, was the final link in the compliance chain. The timestamp on that sign-off, 4:57 p.m., Wednesday, 4 minutes before close of business. No one noticed, no one cared. Victor was too busy photoshopping himself into the investor deck. But I knew what I'd done. I knew that my signature wasn't just a formality. It was the lock on the vault. The clause in the investor agreement that required a named compliance officer of record to validate the filings. And I was that name. That night, I packed my bag slower than usual, looked around at the half-lit office like it was a funeral home, and I was the last one paying respects. The funny part is, I didn't even dislike the job. I hated what it became under Victor. I hated how small people with big egos can ruin something quietly solid just because they don't understand it. I hated being told my caution was fear and my process was resistance. And I hated that I still cared. So I finished my tea, checked the audit log one last time, and walked out. My phone buzzed, Victor again, posting some cringe LinkedIn drivel about breaking silos and disruption. I smiled, not because I was happy, but because I was ready. Thursday afternoon smelled like fresh pizza and future lawsuits. The company had ordered lunch, pepperoni, and plastic smiles for the big funding readiness walkthrough. The war room, aka the second-floor conference room with the busted thermostat, was packed with engineers, product leads, HR, and Victor, who strutted in like he was about to ring the NASDAQ bell with his forehead. He clapped his hands once, just once, and people shut up like he had a remote control for human dignity. All right, people, he boomed, pacing like a motivational speaker who'd mainlined espresso and ego, we're at the finish line. Investors are ready. Product is stable and compliance. He stopped, looked right at me. Well, we're still waiting on some final slow walk checkboxes, right, Julia? The room chuckled, not loud enough to be bold, but just enough to let him know they knew which side their bread was microdosed with equity on. I didn't flinch. I was reviewing a line item on the escrow verification letter. All filings are submitted and certified, I said without even looking up. Nothing's slow. Everything's exact. That should have been the end of it, but Victor couldn't resist peacocking. He leaned over the table, grinning like a frat boy about to prank the R-Ray. You know what your problem is, Julia? He asked, loud enough for the intern in the hallway to hear. You're mistaking caution for relevance. Don't be happy, be gone. The words hit like a slap made of paper cuts. Nobody laughed, but nobody stepped in either. Victor turned to HR, who, to their credit, looked like they wanted to melt into their chairs and said, revoke her badge, and remove her from all Slack channels, effective immediately. My screen blinked. Slack signed me out mid-sentence. The badge around my neck went dead like a guillotine had cut the signal. And that's when I smiled. Not fake corporate, not brittle. Real, cold. The kind of smile that makes people uncomfortable because it doesn't match the moment. Okay, I said simply, gathering my notebook, my tea thermos, and the envelope I always kept in my desk drawer, just in case. Victor tilted his head, confused by my lack of protest. He wanted a scene, a meltdown, something to prove his power. What he got was silence and a woman who knew exactly what she was doing. Before I walked out, I sat at the edge of the table, opened my laptop one last time, and forwarded an email. Subject line: Formal Resignation and Compliance Transition Notice. Recipient: Mark Giddens, Senior Auditor, Wexley and Stein LLP. I attached the timestamp. 2:37 p.m. Eastern, just minutes after being locked out, and then I stood. People shifted. Chairs creaked. One of the product managers blinked like she was watching someone jump out of an airplane without a parachute. "She's really going?" I heard someone whisper. Like I hadn't just been fired in front of a live studio audience. I walked down the hallway like it was a runway, and the whole building had turned to fog. Half the sales team was still stuffing their faces with free pizza. My badge didn't beep at the exit, just gave one sad red blink, like a machine mourning a loss it didn't understand. Out in the parking lot, the October wind slapped me in the face, hard and cleansing. I stood there for a second, then laughed deep from the belly. Not because I'd been humiliated, but because no one in that building had any idea what had just broken. They thought I was a cog. They thought compliance was copy-paste and that signatures were stickers. They thought you could rip out the foundation the day before the housewarming party and no one would notice. But the thing about foundations, you don't realize they're gone until everything's already falling. By 8:07 a.m., Friday, Victor had already triple spritzed himself with whatever cologne smells like unearned confidence and parking lot Red Bulls. He strutted into the office like a man who thought he'd just shot the final scene in a hero movie, not the prelude to a train wreck. The main conference room was decked out like a venture-funded wedding. Catered breakfast from that bougie place with $6 croissants, fresh-cut fruit nobody was going to touch. And of course, 3 unopened bottles of champagne sweating in silver buckets. The founder, Daniel, was pacing in front of the whiteboard, mumbling his pitch under his breath like it was a TED talk that could summon the next round of capital. End-to-end architecture, zero trust compliance, cross-platform scalability, he was saying, eyes twitching from nerves or caffeine or both. Victor clapped him on the shoulder, teeth gleaming. "Relax, Daniel, it's done. Noon today and we're unicorns." People buzzed around like ants high on stock options. The vibes were electric, desperate, delusional. At 8:42, in the middle of setting up a screen share for the final pre-call with investor relations, a junior project manager, Amanda, sharp as hell despite being treated like an afterthought, furrowed her brow at the checklist. "Hey," she said cautiously, eyes still on her laptop, "do we have Julia's sign-off on the final disclosure packet?" The room wobbled for a moment. Victor didn't even look up from his phone. "Legal has it," he muttered. Amanda hesitated. "Are you sure? The version I have ends with her placeholder, not her signature." Victor finally glanced up, lips pursed like he'd just been asked to spell integrity. "She's compliance, not mission critical. Legal wraps that up anyway, it's covered." Amanda nodded, but her eyes didn't stop scanning. Her fingers flew across the keyboard, cross-referencing the internal sign-off matrix. Her voice went quieter. She was the named officer of record. "The clause says the sign-off has to be from the officer and role at time of submission." Victor blinked. "We submitted." "Amanda, no, she submitted the Q3 report, but the disclosure packet is different. It needed its own signature." Final version was finished Thursday at 10 a.m. Victor's jaw tightened just enough to register behind his Botox-smoothed skin. "Legal has it," he repeated, this time with slightly less oxygen. Meanwhile, Daniel looked up from his notes. "Julia was still employed when the final edits were made, right?" Victor opened his mouth, closed it, then forced a shrug. "It's irrelevant. She didn't contribute anything meaningful. I reviewed it myself." Amanda, now clearly sweating, added, "You're not the compliance officer. It's a legal designation. You're not authorized to validate the filings." Victor waved his hand through the air like he was brushing away a fart. "Look, the investors don't care who signs what as long as the numbers are solid. It's just red tape." He smiled. A real big CEO-in-the-making grin. What he didn't know, what no one in that room seemed to grasp, was that Julia's role wasn't ceremonial. It wasn't filler. It was structure. Her signature wasn't a rubber stamp. It was the only legal bridge between internal filings and external audit verification. And legal didn't have anything. Because Julia never signed the final packet. Because Julia, as of 2:37 p.m., Thursday, no longer worked there. But Victor didn't know that yet, or maybe he just didn't want to. So the day marched on, high fives flying, toasts preemptively drafted. They were gearing up to celebrate the deal of the decade. And somewhere in a silent folder marked urgent, audit trail, the absence of one woman's name had already started to rot everything from the inside. At 9:13 a.m., right as Victor was walking back from his pre-victory latte run, an email hit the shared executive inbox like a stray bullet. Subject line: urgent. Julia Ames sign-off confirmation needed before noon close. Sender: Martin H. Gill, lead counsel, Midtown Capital. The body was clinical but cold. Per closing procedure, we require final compliance documentation signed by the active officer of record for regulatory acknowledgement. Please confirm Julia Ames' signature on the updated disclosure packet and provide continuity compliance memo as discussed. Deadline, 11:30 a.m. EST. MHG Victor's smile twitched just slightly. He stood frozen halfway into the conference room, fingers clenched around a paper cup that said "You got this" in cheery blue font. He reread it, then again. Then he hit forward, barely typing a note above the thread. "Can someone confirm Julia signed this?" He blasted it to HR, legal, and Amanda, as if urgency could be crowdsourced. The first reply came from legal: "We don't have the final signature on file." Second reply, HR, short, brutal: "She resigned. You said it was fine." Molly Victor stared at it like the words were in Morse code. Then hit reply all. When exactly did she resign? Another HR ping, this time with an attachment. A PDF, Julia's resignation email sent at 2:37 p.m. Thursday, timestamped, confirmed, and digitally initialed. The final sentence hit him hardest. As of this message, I am no longer serving in the capacity of compliance officer for Cardant Systems, effective immediately. His face drained. Amanda leaned in through the open conference room door. Do we have the continuity memo? Midtown's been asking for it all week. Victor blinked like she'd spoken in a dialect of regret. What memo? The continuity memo. It confirms compliance oversight wasn't interrupted during the transition. Only the outgoing officer can issue it. Silence. Victor checked his phone. Opened Julia's contact. Texted, "Need to talk ASAP, please respond urgently." No response. He called voicemail after 2 rings. He called again, straight to voicemail. Daniel was now at the window, tapping his pen against the glass like Morse code for "I will kill you if this falls apart." "Everything okay?" he asked without turning. Victor forced a chuckle. Yeah, just a formality. Legal's cleaning it up." Amanda wasn't buying it. She didn't sign the disclosure packet. "If we don't have the memo either," then Victor cut her off. "Don't panic." But he was already sweating. Because panic had already arrived, it just hadn't made its entrance yet. And now the champagne was no longer chilled. It was sweating like he was. He opened his laptop and tried drafting a memo himself, Googling language from Julia's past filings like he was doing a high school book report 5 minutes before class. But the system wouldn't let him submit under her credentials. Access revoked. He tried using his own signature line. The portal blinked back, unauthorized. Amanda hovered. "Even if you wrote it, it wouldn't be valid. Julia has to issue it. It's on the investor's checklist. Clause 9B. Victor stood up suddenly, chair scraping behind him. "I'll call Midtown myself. Smooth it over." He walked into the hallway and shut the door behind him. Inside, the room fell still. Amanda refreshed the inbox. Another email came through from Midtown's legal team. Subject, follow up. Compliance memo. Julia Ames required. No one said a word. Because now, even the interns could feel it. Something was missing. And it wasn't just a signature, it was the one person who knew how to stop this thing from unraveling. At 10:04 a.m. sharp, the company's bank, Bannerstone Trust, received an automated hold request on escrow account hash 448-19. The request came from Midtown Capital's legal division and was flagged for immediate compliance verification. The subject line alone could make a CFO's heart stop. Escrow pause, awaiting officer confirmation and regulatory memo per Clause 9B. 3 minutes later, legal pinged Victor on Slack, what was once Julia's domain now full of emoji reactions and shallow applause. Legal, 10:07 a.m. We've just been notified the escrow is frozen pending compliance verification. Midtown is requesting we provide the continuity memo signed by Julia Ames. They're refusing to proceed otherwise. Victor read it 3 times, then muttered shit under his breath loud enough for the intern next to him to pretend not to hear. He straightened his spine, forced a grin, and asked for more coffee. Daniel noticed. "Everything okay? Fine. It's just banking logistics. You know how they are, cautious." Victor's voice was steady, but his collar was suddenly tighter, like someone had turned up the pressure on his own necktie. Then the elevators dinged. Early. The first board member stepped out, Darlene Cho, audit pitbull, hair sharper than most blades. She was followed by Armin Ghazari, the investor liaison with the personality of a redacted CIA file. They weren't due until noon. Victor's smile twitched like a muscle giving out. "Didn't expect you all until the close," he said, opening his arms like a magician mid-flourish. Darlene set her bag down with the kind of precision that usually came before lawsuits. Midtown called a check-in, said there's a gap in the compliance trail, figured we should hear it in real time. Victor's knuckles tightened around his ceramic coffee mug. Daniel blinked. "Wait, what gap? We filed everything. Didn't we?" Amanda, now fully red-eyed and riding a wave of dread, chimed in from the corner. "Julia didn't sign the final disclosure packet, and we don't have the continuity memo. Legal says only the officer of record can certify continuity at submission." Victor's jaw twitched. "They're making a mountain out of a line item." Darlene raised an eyebrow. "A $250 million line item." Victor tried to speak again, but was interrupted by another ping, this time from the law firm representing their Series D syndicate. "No additional funds will be dispersed until regulatory chain is intact. Please confirm Julia Ames' official status." The lawyer's message had all the warmth of a death notice. Victor pulled out his phone, scrolled with desperation, and opened Julia's file, finally digging through her email trail like it held some loophole, some buried clause to save his ass. And there it was, dated 3 weeks prior. Subject line, clarification on officer transition policy. Julia had written it directly to him. Victor, for clarity, compliance authority cannot be retroactively reassigned. If I'm removed without formal transition, regulatory continuity is legally compromised. Please don't assume otherwise. Victor had never replied. He just archived it, because back then he thought she was exaggerating, overcomplicating, being rigid, that word again. And now, in real time, he was watching the floor drop out from under him. One of the VPs walked past with a forced smile and said, "Almost party time, right?" Victor nodded, dead behind the eyes. "Yeah, almost." More board members arrived. The CFO whispered to legal, "Should we prep the fallback plan?" "There isn't one," legal whispered back. Because without Julia's memo, without her sign-off, the whole funding event was suspended midair like a glass chandelier held up by dental floss. And somewhere, Victor realized that for the first time in his puffed-up, ego-soaked career, he couldn't bluff his way out. Because the woman he'd erased was the only one who could unfreeze the deal. And she was gone. The boardroom smelled like overbrewed coffee and barely masked fear. The lights buzzed overhead, too bright, too sterile. Someone had wheeled in a tray of untouched croissants that now looked like props from a play about denial. The walls, usually lined with abstract tech optimism posters, suddenly felt like prison bars painted beige. Victor stood at the head of the table, stiff as a mannequin, while Daniel, the founder, sat to his right, rapidly thumbing through his phone as if a missed Slack message could reverse a legal implosion. The CFO, pale and visibly sweating, had her hands folded so tightly they looked fused. Two investors, silent, stone-faced, occupied the far end of the table, arms crossed like executioners waiting for the nod. The only sound was the crackle of the speakerphone as Midtown Capital dialed in. Conference initiated, the robotic voice chirped. Then came the voice of Martin H. Gill, lead investor counsel, calm and deliberate, the tone of someone who's had to kill dreams for a living. "Good morning," he said. "We'll make this brief. As of 10:04 a.m., escrow funds remain frozen due to an unresolved compliance failure." Victor cleared his throat. "That's a misunderstanding. Our internal team's resolving it now. There's been some confusion around sign-off attribution. Is Julia Ames present?" Martin asked flatly. Victor blinked. "No, she's no longer with the company." A brief pause. "Then, who authorized terminating your compliance officer on the eve of a $250 million funding close?" All heads turned toward Victor. He forced a smile that died halfway up his cheeks. "She was being disruptive," he said, "combative, slowing us down. I made the call." Martin didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. She was the one person legally empowered to sign the final compliance chain, he said. No transition memo was filed. Her digital credentials were not passed, nor reassigned through regulatory channels. That renders your disclosure packet invalid. The air left the room like someone had opened a hatch at 30,000 feet. Daniel's phone slipped from his hand and hit the table with a thud. The CFO leaned in, eyes wide. "Wait, invalid like? Not fixable invalid?" Martin's voice remained flat, not retroactively. Julia was the named officer of record. According to the timestamp on her resignation email, she stepped down at 5:01 p.m. yesterday. Victor jumped in. "That's only a minute past 5. The window was still, the cutoff for legal validation was 5 o'clock p.m. EST. Martin interrupted. "Per Clause 9b in the funding protocol you signed, which I should remind you Julia negotiated on your behalf." Daniel buried his face in his hands. Christ. Martin continued. "Additionally, requested a continuity memo to preserve legal chain of command between filings. It was not received. Julia was the only person authorized to issue it. Without it, we are in breach territory." Victor tried to pivot. "Surely there's a way to know," Martin snapped, cutting through him like a blade. "There isn't." Silence. The boardroom might as well have been a tomb. One of the investors slowly leaned forward. "Did you even know about the memo?" Victor looked at his shoes. "Not specifically." The other investor, Armin, simply sighed. "You nuked our legal credibility for personality clash?" Victor raised his head, voice cracking. "She was difficult to work with, always so obsessed with procedure." "And that's exactly what we were investing in," Martin said. "Procedure, regulatory integrity, not charisma." The call ended with a final word from Martin, delivered with the finality of a judge's gavel. "We will be recommending immediate withdrawal from the round. The deal as it stands cannot proceed." Click, dead silence. No one moved. Victor looked around for something, support, explanation, a trap door to vanish through. All he found were stares, not angry, worse, disappointed. He sank into his chair like a man finally realizing he'd kicked out the load-bearing wall and expected the ceiling to hold. Julia had warned him exactly what would happen. He'd deleted her email. He'd mocked her, erased her from Slack like she was a speed bump. Now the house was crumbling, and the silence was deafening. Victor's hands trembled just enough to smear the ink on the signature line as he attempted to scrawl his name where Julia's should have gone. It wasn't even subtle. He printed it like a panicked fifth grader trying to forge a parent's signature on a field trip slip. The pen skipped. His face flushed. He looked up at the CFO like a child showing a drawing, desperate for approval. She didn't even look at the paper. "You're not the compliance officer." He muttered something about emergency delegation, but no one was listening anymore. They were watching a man unravel. Legal had already tried submitting his revised disclosure packet to the auditor, who sent back an icy rejection within minutes. Subject: filing invalid officer of record required from Jenna M. Audit Associate Wexley and Stein LLP 2. Legal Team Cardant Systems. Julia Ames was the certified officer of record at time of final packet assembly. Her credentials were revoked prior to the compliance window. Substitution is not permitted post-resignation. Signature chain broken. Filing integrity compromised. The phrase "filing integrity compromised" hit like a sentence in a medical diagnosis: dry, technical, and terminal. Victor gripped the table. Knuckles white. "Then we delay," he snapped. "Push the funding. A few days, just a hiccup." The CFO looked toward Midtown's investor rep Armin, who'd been standing near the window all morning with arms folded like a bouncer at the gates of consequences. Armin didn't even blink. "That window is closed." Victor stared at him like he'd misheard. "You're saying no extension?" "I'm saying your filing is legally dead," Armin replied. "This was a coordinated, multi-party deal. Our entire risk profile was structured around that timeline. The train's gone. But there's still interest," Victor pushed. "They still want to invest." "They did," Armin said, emphasis cold as a snowstorm, "when you had your shit together." Victor turned to HR like a drowning man reaching for a floating stapler. "You didn't flag her resignation," he barked. "You didn't escalate, you let her walk. This is on you." HR Director Molly, calm and still as a firing squad captain, didn't flinch. "We followed your directive," she said. "You said, quote, make her disappear before EOD. She's toxic." The founder Daniel winced so hard his face seemed to fold inward. "You said that?" he whispered. Victor looked around for backup, but the room had already begun to shrink away from him, people leaning back in chairs, crossing arms, glancing down at phones like maybe another headline would break the silence. In the corner, Amanda stared at her laptop screen, still open to the Slack thread from yesterday where Victor had posted a gif of a guillotine with the caption, "New process for dead weight." No one had laughed, but no one had said anything either. Now they all remembered. Victor pounded the table once, an impotent thud that landed somewhere between rage and surrender. The CFO took a breath. "If the funding collapses, we'll have to halt expansion, delay Q4 hiring, possibly pause the product launch." The silence that followed was worse than shouting. It was consent. Legal slowly began gathering their folders. Armin finally uncrossed his arms. "I'd recommend your board convene without him present," he said. Victor's head jerked up. "Excuse me, this isn't salvageable, but some of your leadership may still be." Daniel looked like he might be sick. Victor opened his mouth to argue, to plead, to pull some last rabbit out of a shredded hat, but nothing came. No signature, no memo, no funding, nothing. Julia hadn't raised her voice, hadn't thrown a tantrum, hadn't burned anything on her way out. All she'd done was sign her resignation and walk. And now the man who said she was just compliant sat alone at a 12-foot table, surrounded by the ruins of a deal no one would ever rebuild. At 11:02 a.m., in the same room that had been prepped for celebration, champagne buckets sweating like guilty men under lights, congratulatory name cards still perched like gravestones, a grim, post-mortem silence hung in the air. Victor sat hunched at the end of the table like a man awaiting sentencing, while the board muttered and whispered in small clusters, trying to calculate who would bleed and who would walk. The CFO flipped through her iPad with a kind of mechanical detachment, like she was trying to dissociate through calendar invites and unread Slack threads. Then Amanda, who'd remained mostly silent since her early warnings were dismissed, spoke up from the side of the room. "Has anyone checked where Julia actually went?" Her voice sliced through the tension like piano wire. Victor looked up, bloodshot and blinking. "What?" Amanda's fingers moved fast, browser open, tabs firing like missiles. She typed, "Julia Ames plus new role," and there it was. Center screen, clear as sunlight. "Midtown Capital welcomes Julia Ames as Director of Regulatory Strategy," published. 9:07 a.m. Today's subhead: "We're thrilled to add Julia's deep regulatory expertise to our leadership team at a time when precision and risk integrity matter more than ever." No one spoke. The only sound was the HVAC wheezing overhead like it, too, was processing what this meant. Amanda scrolled. The photo attached to the article showed Julia, calm, poised, confident, standing next to Martin Gill, the same investor lawyer who had just disemboweled their funding dreams over speakerphone. Daniel leaned forward, eyes wide, and glossed over. "Wait, Midtown?" Midtown was in the deal. They were one of the three firms backing our round. Silence answered him, heavy, cold, brutal. She switched sides, someone finally whispered. No one corrected them. Victor stood, a wild, broken energy twitching through his frame. This was sabotage. She tanked us on purpose. It's a conflict of interest. Amanda didn't even flinch. Only if she joined before she resigned. She didn't. The article says effective Friday morning. She was gone before the deal collapsed. The CFO slowly raised her eyes. You mean she timed it? Amanda nodded. Looks like it. Daniel exhaled like a man being exercised. She warned us. Victor's voice cracked. She threatened. No, Daniel snapped. She warned you. You just didn't listen. Everyone remembered now. That quiet, measured tone Julia always used when explaining the risks, the procedures, the things no one ever wanted to slow down long enough to understand. She'd flagged the gaps, sent memos, even spoke directly to Victor about succession protocol, about what would happen if the compliance chain broke mid-cycle. She hadn't hidden anything. She just watched, waited, prepared, and while Victor was busy deleting her from Slack like a digital purge, she'd been interviewing, strategizing, positioning, with the very firm that had the power to collapse everything she helped build. And they let her, because they wanted her more than they wanted the circus. Because someone, somewhere in Midtown, had read those filings and seen the name Julia Ames and said, that's the one holding it all together. Victor slumped back into his chair, pale as drywall. Why didn't she say anything? He muttered. Amanda closed her laptop with finality. She didn't need to, because Julia wasn't screaming on her way out the door. She was walking through another one that opened into a boardroom with better lighting, sharper knives, and a chair reserved just for her. The call came at 11:28 a.m. sharp, just 2 minutes before the closing deadline. Everyone in the boardroom was frozen in place, Victor halfway standing, the CFO clutching her tablet like a life raft, Daniel still muttering under his breath about maybe we can delay, and the two investors sitting like stone statues with thousand-yard stares. The speakerphone crackled to life. Martin H. Gill's voice, sharp and measured as ever, echoed through the silence. Our auditor has completed final checks. Victor swallowed hard, nodding like the man still running the meeting. Martin continued. The chain of custody on your compliance filing ends at 5:01 p.m. yesterday. No one moved. Our compliance officer resigned 1 minute after the cutoff for legal validation. There is no continuity memo. There is no active signature. Victor opened his mouth, perhaps to deny, perhaps to beg, but Martin didn't wait. Beat. The deal is off. Click. Silence. Not dramatic, not chaotic, just hollow, like the oxygen had been sucked out of the room. Victor sat back down as if gravity had just remembered he existed. His eyes glazed over, mouth slightly open, the corner of his jacket still wrinkled from when he'd stood in triumph only hours earlier. No one looked at him. No one offered a word of comfort. Daniel stared at the wall, blinking slowly like he'd forgotten how to speak. The CFO gently closed her tablet and reached for kwasa she didn't eat. One of the investors stood and left the room without a word, briefcase still zipped shut. A quiet thud echoed through the building as the future slammed shut. And across town, several floors up in a different building, sunlight filtering through clean glass, Julia Ames stirred honey into her coffee. The room around her was calm, minimalist, uncluttered. On her screen, the market news ticker rolled across, breaking, Cardant Systems $250M funding round collapses amid internal compliance failure. She didn't smile. Not quite. Instead, she took a sip and leaned back in her chair, watching the rest of the article unfold like a well-rehearsed overture. They'd blame internal misalignment. They'd say the timing was unfortunate. They'd insist lessons had been learned, but Julia knew. She knew compliance wasn't just forms and signatures, it was structure, weight, precision. It was the steel in the frame, not the paint on the walls. And when you rip the steel out and expect the house to stand, well, her laptop pinged. New email. From Deshaun Green, Senior Partner. Midtown Capital, subject, welcome, ready when you are. Julia closed the tab on Cardance, opened the onboarding portal, and never once looked back. Appreciate you sticking around, you legends of the break room. Subscribe for more chaos. Let's make your old managers spill their coffee in fear.